I love my son-in-law. Son-in-law. Escape. Words of that defendant, Justin Ross Harris. Words that reveal motive to this man killing his child. Most horrific, imaginable way. Words of this defendant uttered minutes or locked his son in a car, left him to die. Cobb County parking lot. I love my son-in-law. Words of a killer who, in this case, the evidence will show, chose the worst imaginable death for his child. Double life. Words that he used, or he closed the door on his 22-month-old child's life. Walk that other life. On June the 18th, 2014, minutes before he closed the door on that child, while that child sat in the car, this child sat in a car, faking to death. The evidence will show that this defendant that day messaging over 30 people. Most of them women. Most of them about sex. Women that he had met before. Women that he had professed love before. Women he'd met online and exchanged comments about being unhappy in his marriage. Women he'd met in parking lots for random sex acts. On that day, while his child was cooking to death, also messaging a girl he met when she was 16, who was 17 at the time, still trying to get pictures of her vaginal area from her. I love my son-in-law, but we both need escapes. Words of this defendant on 18,000. While he was doing that all day, son out in the car, slowly, painfully, ladies and gentlemen, while defendant Justin Ross Harris is charged with 8 counts. This case involves the defendant drove 0.6 miles after eating breakfast with his child at a Chick-fil-A. While at that Chick-fil-A, talking to a random woman about how to a post on an application called Whisper, where supposedly you can post anonymous thoughts and things like that. On that morning, someone posted this: I hate being married with kids. The novelty is worn off, and I have nothing to show for it. Evidence will show that this bonded, talking about how his wife got mad at him when he wanted to go out, how 5 minutes before he locked that child in the car, or 10 minutes before he locked that child in the car, he needed an escape. And in finishing that conversation, while he ostensibly was forgetting this child, about a minute before he pulled into the parking lot at his work. That's what this case is about, ladies and gentlemen. Defendant driving 0.6 miles from Chick-fil-A, and instead of taking the child to daycare, he did routinely drove to work and left the child in the car. While he was doing that, I'm forgetting my child, but continue to text and message about his child and needing him. Deception. Death. Torturous murder of Cooper Harris. About the pain that he suffered and went through, father could move on to his other life. It's about deception. All over this case and all over this defendant's life. Deception, family and friends, deception with law enforcement, deception in every part of this case. A double life. Reveals his motive, shows the malice that he had in ending this child's life. Cooper Harris. Child was born August 2nd, 2012. Out in the Home Depot parking lot in Cobb County on June 8th, 2014. Luckily, funny in jury selection, the defense, I think, asked several questions about perspectives. Look for other perspectives. Do you, when you hear something, do you just take it at face value, or do you consider different perspectives and different angles and talk to different people about what they think or what the evidence is or things like that? Everybody's like, yeah, you have to look at it from different perspectives. Thank goodness, Cobb County Police Department decided not just to take the defendant's initial story. Thank goodness they decided to look at other perspectives, not just his self-serving statement trying to lessen his culpability. Because in this case, the evidence is going to show at the end, when you go back in that jury room, if you just take the defendant's words and what he said that day about what he had done, and then the acts of what he was doing that day, the defendant right there is guilty of negligent homicide and all the other counts in the indictment related to sexting, which you're going to hear about. However, ladies and gentlemen, the police didn't just say, you know what, we're just going to chalk it up as a negligent homicide and stop there. They luckily took other steps and did an investigation that turned out to be unimaginable. What the child went through that day, what the child suffered, what he had been doing earlier that day. They took the perspective of the evidence at the scene. Ladies and gentlemen, in this case, you're going to hear, started out, and we'll talk about it in a minute, how from kind of the investigation standpoint, we'll go in that order. The defendant pulled into a parking lot in Cobb County Acres Mill Shopping Center. Got out of his car in a very crowded area with lots of lots of businesses and lots of people milling around, jumped out of his car, said, "What have I done? What have I done?" Hear about the perspectives and the evidence at this scene. Evidence, somebody's behavior that was not consistent with somebody who had just discovered their child in the backseat having forgotten them. Evidence that this defendant, after he got out, did he cry, "Somebody call 911. Somebody come help my child"? No. What have I done? Here's the perspective and the evidence from the scene in this case, where the defendant, after a person came over to help, because there were people all around this area, came over to help him get the child out of the car. And after, as you're going to hear, he messed around for a second, said he knew CPR. After a second of doing that, you're going to hear that somebody else, an innocent bystander, or a bystander, didn't know this child from anyone, comes in and tries to help perform CPR on this child. What does he do? Child. Claiming he just realized he out of his vehicle. Doesn't start calling 911. Starts trying to call his wife and trying to call daycare. Doesn't call 911 and separates himself from this child. No tears, as will be described, kind of like Will Ferrell screaming, "Oh gosh, what have I done? What have I done?" And then he's calm. While people who don't even know this child don't give up and try to save his life. Behavior at the scene with the police. You're going to hear that Detective Piper, now Detective Investigator Piper, was officer back then, came up and asked him. She saw him walking back and forth, pacing away from the child, and asked for his identification, his information. And you're going to hear that he held up his finger to her on the phone, refused to get off the phone, and then got in an argument with the police. Told Officer Foley, who was also at the scene, to shut the F up. My son just died. Minutes after pulling that child out, he's already talking, my son just died. Anyway, perspectives with the evidence at the scene. We're going to talk more about this in a minute, but different perspectives. They didn't just look at that. They talked to the witnesses there, the evidence on the scene, the defendant's behavior at Acres Mill, the defendant's behavior in the patrol car once he was detained, the evidence from the witnesses in this case, took that perspective as well. Actually went and found video evidence, parking lots, from the Chick-fil-A. Also the perspectives of computer and phone evidence that you're going to hear about in this case. Now, the charges that the defendant has in the indictment, the judge has already talked to you about them a little bit, read them to you, and explained a little bit about what the elements are in the charges. Now, we'll talk more about a closing argument arguing why the defendant is guilty of each count and what the elements are. But to talk through how we're going to be going through and why the defendant is charged in certain ways in this indictment, we'll start by looking at the counts. We've got count 1, malice murder, counts 2 and 3, felony murder, counts 4 and 5, cruelty to children, count 4 is in the first degree, count 5 is in the second degree, count 6, criminal attempt sexual exploitation, and count 7 and 8, dissemination of harmful materials to minors. So what I'm going to do real quick is kind of go through this with you, and we'll talk about how these charges interrelate to one another. And it'll make it pretty simple once we go through it like this. So starting with count 1, malice murder, charges the defendant with that count for intentionally killing his child. Count 2, felony murder is a charge that we don't have to prove the intent to kill. It's basically, we prove that he caused the death of another by the commission of a felony. And in this case, count 4, cruelty to children in the first degree, that charges him with causing cruel and excessive physical pain little Cooper. So all three of these counts, 1, 2, and 4, involve the intentional killing of this child. In this case, count 1, count 2, and count 4, the intentional killing of Cooper. The question is going to be, is he guilty of all the charges in this indictment, or counts 3, 5, and 6 through 8? Ladies and gentlemen, at the end of this evidence, there's going to be no doubt that he is guilty of every charge in this indictment. So let's look at counts 3 and 5. What we have with counts 3 and 5, this is just a lesser mental status, a lesser, level of culpability, so to speak. Count 3, felony murder based on cruelty to children in the second degree. Cruelty to children in the second degree is causing cruel or excessive physical pain by criminal negligence. Ladies and gentlemen, just the starting point in this case. Starting point. Things the defendant admitted to the police initially and what was going on with him that day, that starting point right there. The defendant's going to be guilty of all counts. 3, 5, 6, 7, and 8. However, luckily, you don't stop there, and the police didn't stop there. Because the evidence will show, not just the defendant's self-serving statements that convicts him of these, but the evidence will show not only guilty of these, but he is guilty of all counts charged. Now, count 6, 7, and 8. These all involve acts against a minor who was 17, 16 when the act started, 17 on the day of the incident. That up till and on the day he died, he was still messaging minor. These charges charge him with attempting to get her to send him a photograph of her vaginal area over the course of months. You're going to hear that he was talking with this girl for a long time. All of these conversations were sexually related. You'll hear this from numerous women in this case. Lie about his age, say anything about being married, and then as he got to know and worked his way into meeting these girls and knowing them, he would then come off it and say, oh yeah, well I'm married and I have a kid. Now 7 and 8 are relevant to sending pictures of his anatomy to this underage girl. And writings about sex acts that he wanted to do to her or with her. So again, just looking at the evidence that was on his phone that he was doing that day, the defendant, again, is guilty of count 6, 7, and 8. So the single question in this case is, did the defendant intend to kill Cooper Harris when he did all the things and intended to do all the things that killed this child? Did he intend to? Ladies and gentlemen, with this indictment, did he intend to kill this child or not? The starting point, accepting everything that he said as true that day, he is guilty of counts 3, 5, 6, 7, and 8. But the evidence is going to show that he is undoubtedly guilty of all counts. Because you'll see the deception, double life that this ended. How he behaved and how he lied in this. The defendant intended to kill Cooper when he intended to do all of the things that killed Cooper. Facts of this case only make sense. The defendant had planned intentionally killing Cooper. How did it start? Kind of a timeline of the day, just so you know, just starting as a baseline. That morning, about 9 a.m., right here, the defendant arrived at Chick-fil-A, Chick-fil-A with Cooper. At breakfast, and at 9:20 and 30 seconds, they walked out of Chick-fil-A together. Cooper wide awake, alive, having just eaten breakfast. 9:25:17, less than 5 minutes later, you see we have video of the defendant pulling into his parking lot at Home Depot Treehouse. 9:26:15 a.m. on video. Now this video is kind of like, y'all seen the Bigfoot videos and things like that. This is security video from a long ways away, so it's kind of grainy and things like that. But you see him close the door on that car. That boy still inside. Wasn't like, you'll see, he got out, parked the car, and just jumped out and left. You're going to see that after he parked that car, he was around and in that car and did not close the door for at least 30 seconds after parking. Talk a lot more about this. 12:42 that day, he had gone to lunch. He gets back to the car. Yeah, he gets back from lunch to his car. Buddies don't drop him off at the office. Drop him in his car, and he goes inside. Talk a little bit more about what he did in there in a minute. 4:16:07, drives away from work. Unlike you're going to see when he pulls in and fiddles around in the car, stays in the car for 30 seconds, you're going to see that he gets in the car, and as soon as the door shuts, windows up, gone. Within 3 seconds, that car is over. Car's been parked out there all day, in the heat. You know it's hot. But diaper. Drives off. And at 4:22 p.m., 4:22:50, the first 911 call is made from Acres Mill. Not by the defendant, by an innocent bystander. Now, the facts of the case, we're going to take this from the investigation standpoint, kind of from that order. That day, about 4:22 p.m., and it pulls into the Acres Mill Shopping Center. When he pulls in, he gets out as we talked about. What have I done? What have I done? Everybody else tries to save his child while he's walking around. After he gets detained by the police, you're going to hear from Officer Piper that he had a phone. The phone that he was not getting off of, he tries to slip it into his back pocket. That is the instrument for why he's not paying attention and not listening to them. They detain him and they take that from him. And then he was put into the back of the patrol car, gave a history, gave a brief statement about what had happened. Not only going to hear the testimony of the officer, whole video and the recordings of this defendant, minutes after pulling his son out of the car, dead. Hear him yell at the police initially, then handcuffing him, and then you're going to hear the behavior, the demeanor, and the manipulation start from there. What's supposed to happen that way? You're going to hear later that he'd already planned that he was going to be an advocate. Seen somebody on TV do this before, and so he wanted to be an advocate like this guy. We'll get to that later. But you're going to see the manipulation and deception start here. He's already recognized the officer by name, starts calling her Officer Piper, tells her what happened. Oh, his story, what happened. No, I was supposed to take my son today to daycare. I guess I forgot, and I forgot to do a second look. I forgot to do a second look. Those are the words he used. Now, you all were asked several questions in jury selection. You know, who here has heard PSAs? Who's heard this? Who's heard that? And we heard plenty of jurors say, you know, I don't remember them exactly. You know, I know it's about this, it's about that. Right after, minutes after he's pulled his son out, he's already getting his. I did not do a second look while his son is dead on the pavement. Also, while sitting there in that car, a little background about what was going on that day. Gotten up that morning, gotten the son, that he noticed the child, and then after he gives this brief history and tries to get in and work in the fact that, well, I used to be in law enforcement, you're going to hear how he does that, because you're going to find out later, he used to be a dispatcher, not a police officer, but a dispatcher in Tuscaloosa. You're going to hear him in the back of the car, drive him away a little bit further from the calm, cool, and collected. What does he complain about? Is he screaming, "Can I see my son? What's going on?" No. You know what he does? He complains that it's hot in the back of the car. Complains that it's hot in the back of the car. And then you're going to see this patrol video where he's back there for minutes, just hanging out. So it then starts turning around and looking at the scene. You're going to hear from witnesses, too, that talked about him as he's back in that patrol car, keeps looking back, looking around to see what's going on. And again, you're going to hear these antics. For every once in a while, he'll, like he yells out or says something and puts his head in the cushion. But what's important, pay attention when you see this video. Because when he turns around and is not making eye contact, looking at the witnesses, things like that. Now, then his behavior, his demeanor, his manipulation, as they drive away to go to the police department for him to give an interview. Back there in the back of the police car, before he leaves, Detective Stoddard, who's the lead detective in this case, comes over because the defendant had been asking questions. Does the defendant then say, "Can I see my child? What's going on?" Starts complaining about why he's detained. Man who has admittedly caused the death of his own child, debating the legalities of things. And after they leave, you're going to see the video of him driving the defendant in the back of the patrol car with Officer Piper, and him starting to chat her up like they're at a bar. So, how long have you been in law enforcement? "Sir, I can't talk to you right now." Then you're going to see when they finally get to the jail, or to the police department, getting out, trying to get her stuff together, he starts chatting her up again. Not the behavior of someone who unknowingly left their child, negligently left their child in a car to die. Gut-wrenching pain. The worst pain imaginable. No. "Hey, what are you looking for up there?" And she says, "My phone." Or says, "A phone." He says, "My phone?" Concerned about his phone. She's like, "No, my phone." And then as she gets him out of the patrol car to go in, he starts saying, "Oh, these handcuffs, these are kind of like the ones we had back in Tuscaloosa." Chatting her up about that. Baker's Mill, behavior, demeanor, manipulation. When he was detained, behavior, demeanor, manipulation. Patrol car, the same. Now, you're going to hear that after the defendant was detained and taken to Cobb County Police Department, he came in and talked to Detective Stoddard and Detective Waldorf with the Cobb County Police Department. You're going to hear, we've got videotape of the statement that he gave. Mirandized and gave a statement. Now, you're going to see the video where it starts off, as opposed to when he's in the patrol car, and he's turning around trying to make a scene and things like that, and then he's calm, cool, and collected. Once he's in that interview room, you're going to see him try to work himself up, huffing and puffing, things of that nature. The detectives will tell you, never a tear. When they go to talk to him, you're going to hear about his statement, what he said happened that day. I want you to keep an eye on several things. One thing, what he said and what he did not say, schedule and routine, play days. Said and what he did not say. Said that on that day, woke up, because Cooper woke him up at 5:30 that morning. So he got Cooper out of bed, put him in bed with he and his wife, and they watched cartoons. On that morning, Cooper actually fell back asleep. And so he put Cooper back in his bed, in Cooper's bed, and he actually slept in late. Cooper slept in that morning. You're going to hear that defendant stayed in bed with him, hung out, and they knew they were going to be running late. And that he was running late and got up late to go to work, or later than he expected. You're going to hear in this interview about the routine. The defendant initially is asked, it's important in this case, who usually takes this child to daycare? Is this something like, it was out of the ordinary? I was just this freak thing where I had to take him that day. No. He says initially, I usually take him. But then you're going to hear him in this interview back off it. He said, well, it's kind of a coin toss. We never know who's going to do it. Well, you're going to hear, and you're going to see records. And you hear from the witnesses at the daycare that in the mornings, because the defendant worked a stone's throw away from that daycare, that he would take the child in the morning, around 80% of the time. 4 out of 5 days, that was his routine. He took this child. And you're going to hear that they had Chick-fil-A days. You're going to hear the defendant went to Chick-fil-A all the time, but at least 2 or 3 days a month, he would take Cooper in. And they would go sit down and have breakfast, and then he would take him to daycare. So this was not something that was a freak out of the ordinary thing. This was something they did all the time. And he told the police, the people in Chick-fil-A know him. We go there a lot. So keep an eye on that. He says that in his statement, this routine and Chick-fil-A days were special to him. Special to him. He tells the police that this was a normal day. A normal day for him. Nothing out of the ordinary. Never says anything about being stressed out at work or anything like that. Never says anything about being sleep deprived. No distractions and nothing out of the ordinary. With all the details that he gives, you'll see there was nothing forgetful about him that morning and about what he relayed to the police before he got to Chick-fil-A. You're going to hear that Cooper was wide awake, and you're going to see the video that little child, 0.6 miles away, where the defendant locked him in the car to die, was wide awake. That car seat. Not just 0.6 miles. Not just a few minute drive. Inches away. That driver's seat. Car seat not behind him, out of sight. That little boy's head was right there beside him. But now you're starting to see, when the police showed up on the scene, this doesn't make any sense, what the defendant is telling us. That alone shows this defendant knew exactly what he was doing. And in this interview, you're going to hear that the defendant has a great memory about that morning and about what happened when it's convenient for him. Vivid details about that morning and that day. The vivid details about what happened before he left for work. Vivid details about what happened at Chick-fil-A. You're going to hear he told the detectives, oh yeah, I was in there, and we waved to the manager, and you're going to hear all the great lengths he went when he went to Chick-fil-A with Cooper to make sure people noticed him. That we sat down and another person waved at me and all this, and then he remembers these vivid details. He tells law enforcement and Detective Stoddard that I remember I strapped him in, and when I strapped him in the car seat, I was talking to him, and I told him, I love you, and he told me, I love you back. And the defendant says, I always do that because I'm afraid if I get in a car accident, I want it to be the last thing he hears if one of us dies. And you're going to hear that not only did he do that, remember that in a conversation he had with his wife, he said that Cooper, before they left the parking lot, actually said school to him because he knew they were going to daycare. Vivid details. Vivid details that after he did all those with this wide-awake child, he leaves the Chick-fil-A parking lot right here, turns right, and as you turn out of the Chick-fil-A parking lot to go to Home Depot, you turn right here and you do an immediate U-turn right there. And you come back. Let me go back. You do a U-turn right here and you come back that way. Right here to this light. You see? He had to make one U-turn before he got into this lane, the left turn lane, to go to daycare. So it's not 0.6 miles that he would have had to have forgotten. It's basically, you could throw a football across the street. Well, actually, if your Falcons had a good day yesterday, so Matty Ice was throwing bombs, so he could probably throw one over in the parking lot. But that's a hop, skip, and a jump right across the street to where he had to decide, I'm not taking him to daycare. That U-turn. Because right here, this light, you turn left to go to daycare or straight to go to the Treehouse, Home Depot office where the defendant worked. So it's not even just 0.6 miles. It's not even just a few minutes. It's that short a time where he alleges he just forgot. With that child sitting right there. You're also going to hear that the defendant said he was at work that day. Gave vivid details about what he was doing that afternoon. Well, he was going to go to a movie. He was supposed to go to a movie with his friends. He'd set it up, talked about it the night before, and then that morning, and told his wife, yeah, I'm going to go to the movies with some friends, the 5 o'clock movie. He told the police that he wanted to leave work at 4:15 to beat the afternoon rush. A 5 o'clock Wednesday movie showing of 22 Jump Street at a theater like 5-6 minutes away. That's his story. That he had texted his wife checking on her times. And you're going to see this. The defendant in this case, at 3:16 p.m., knowing they'd already settled, he's going to the movie, his wife is going to pick up the baby, he texts her, when are you getting my buddy? He had no reason to ask her about what time she was doing that other than checking up on her. And sure enough, you're going to see the phone records. They talked, and he said they talked at 3:54 or 4:04, talked for 1 minute, and within 10 minutes he's out the door in the car. He departed the parking lot, and you're going to see that on video, and that he said he finally noticed Cooper. Not right as he got in the car. And you're going to see the numerous different times that the defendant would have seen this child. He didn't notice him right away. He didn't notice him after making several turns. At some point, several minutes down the road, by the Acres Mill Shopping Center, he said he tried to change lanes and turned around and got a glimpse of Cooper. no mention about any stench or smell or anything like that. Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear from numerous law enforcement officers, members of the medical examiner's office. They're going to tell you that hours after this, even, once the car was brought back to the evidence shed, and even at the scene, when a couple of the officers poked their head right there by the door, they could smell it. And that's with the door open, having been open for some time, with the air conditioner blasting. A very, very foul stench, one of these officers named. And there are going to be different terms thrown around, like either decomposition or decay, smell of death, sweat, urine, things like that. People use different terms for how they explain things as far as was there decomposition, was there death, anything like that. What there's going to be is no doubt that there was a stench coming from that car. And no doubt that a child sitting in that car for 7 hours baking in the hot Georgia sun with urine in that diaper, with that child's hair matted and shirt soaked through with sweat, would have stunk. And this defendant just hopped in his car, and within 3 seconds of the door shutting is off, windows up, and when he pulled into Acres Mill, the windows were still up. Now, due to details about that morning and that day, also, the timeline of that day and what everyone at the scene was doing in the seconds after he pulled his son out of the car. When he's talking to the detectives, he goes into vivid detail. Not like, oh, this is such a whirlwind, I couldn't believe it, I wasn't focused, I don't know what was going on with my son, No. There were several other people calling 911. These witnesses were doing this. I'm sure you gathered their names, things like that. These are the things he's telling the detective while he's talking to him, giving him details that he paid attention to all of these witnesses and things like that at the scene. And you're going to see from, we'll talk about it a little bit further in a bit, from some of the computer forensic evidence in this case. We talked about a website named Reddit. About a month before this, somebody posted something on there about an incident that had happened, and the defendant actually posted and made a comment about how important it is to have independent witnesses on the scene to corroborate somebody's story. The vivid details at the scene about what everybody else was doing, because he was paying attention. This was not some distraught father. This was somebody who knew exactly what he had done and was trying to get out of it. Okay, now, what about when it's not convenient? What did he say to the police? What did he say to the police when it was not convenient? Lunch. He was asked to go over his timeline of the day. And in doing so, he told Detective Stoddard about lunch. That they had gone to Publix, and he only did this after being asked. So you see at one point, after he gets frisked and they remove things from his pocket before he gets interviewed, a Publix receipt is removed. The defendant who's in there for an interview, you're going to see, takes that receipt and throws it in the trash. But after he's asked about lunch, say, okay, I went to lunch with my buddies at Publix. He talks about who was there, where they went to lunch, who dropped him off, but not about returning to the car. And you'll see this video where he stumbles. And he asked about lunch. And after he's going through it, he says, and I just get dropped off. All these vivid details, but he cannot and will not say what happened. Because what happened is, and his own friends will tell you, yeah, I don't remember us dropping him at his car. Dropped him at his car and they drove off. And when they drove off, he went into that car. They had also stopped at Home Depot, and he didn't mention this, at a Home Depot store. See, here's the thing. In Cobb County, where this occurred, right around this area, Paces Ferry, Cumberland Boulevard, Cumberland Parkway, there's a lot of Home Depot buildings and things like that. You have the headquarters, which is the corporate headquarters, and the daycare, Little Apron Academy. you have the Home Depot Treehouse location, which is where the defendant worked as a computer person a short distance away. And then you also have a Home Depot store where they stop by the Publix after lunch. He didn't mention that. He goes in and buys light bulbs. And when he goes back to the car, he opens the door. He leans forward and he throws light bulbs in it. Opens the driver's side door. And you'll see the photographs of this car. And you'll see the photographs of this car with the door open. You can see clearly into that car. And he throws light bulbs. There's only one reason he would have thrown light bulbs. He knew what he was going to see, and he didn't want to see it. And then he closes the door, and he walks away. Now you're going to see video in this case. You're going to see video of the actual parking lot. Now again, I said this is some grainy surveillance video. You're going to hear testimony. We've had it done where it's been enhanced as much as we can to get a closer view of what actually happened as best we can. And you're going to also see that there were several frames and still shots created from this video to see as best we can what happened. Now in this case, you will see, this is just a still shot example of one of the camera angles at lunch. You're going to hear evidence. You're going to see that this is the defendant right here at his 2011 Hyundai Tucson. Y'all may have been wondering, why in the heck are they asking about a Hyundai, Hyundai. I keep mispronouncing it. A Hyundai Tucson. I guess it's the Griffin in me, growing up in Griffin, Georgia. We just mispronounce everything. So anyway, the Hyundai Tucson leaning into the car. And you're going to see, and you'll have actual hard copies of this as well. We'll see the video. At the next frame, you see this white line right there. The bag being thrown into the car, and then it's gone again. And the police later found that bag in the passenger seat. Now, in addition on that video, you're going to see that the defendant walks away. And as he's walking away, a person walks past him. And not only does that person walk past him, he walks toward the defendant's car at 12:42 p.m. And what does the defendant do? As he walks, you can see right here, the person is behind that tree right there. You'll see it on the video walking that way. The defendant walking and appearing to look back. You're going to see in this video that he stops. He doesn't appear to be looking at anything, his hands or anything of that at this time. And you see the person walk right by his car. And you're going to see this defendant stops. And you're going to see that at some point he gets out his phone and holds it up. And as you're going to see right here in these still shots, it appears, looking at the hair, looking at the color, that his head is turned that way. And that makes complete sense. Because immediately after that person passes the car, guess what he does? The defendant keeps on walking. He has a great memory when it's convenient. He lied about numerous things, the evidence will show, that show he is guilty. He was asked in his interview, what were you doing? Were you on the phone with anybody? Were you distracted? Were you this? Were you that? Were you talking to anybody that morning while you were at Chick-fil-A or on the drive to work? He says no. And you're going to see, in this case, this man was messaging all the time. From the time he went to bed, to random women, sending pictures of his anatomy, to the time he woke up. But in this case, he lied about messaging. Because during that time he was at the Chick-fil-A, and during that time he's driving, he wasn't messaging anybody else but one person. The person who posted this. While he's sitting in the Chick-fil-A, he reads this post about hating being married with kids, and he starts responding. He lies about it because he knows that convicts him. And out of all this time and all these messages he does, that's the only one. And on the drive back to work, he continues that conversation about needing an escape from his son. Within a minute of parking that car in the parking lot. He lied about going back to his car and going inside the car. He told the police he had a great relationship with his wife. Had a great relationship. No problems. Untrue. You're going to hear that their marriage, he was very unhappy in their marriage. That they had had problems, a lot of intimacy problems, and he told numerous women, numerous of these people that he had relationships with, online, in person, that he was unhappy. You're going to hear that he tried to back off about usually dropping Cooper off. He didn't say anything about a stench in the car. And also, when the police talked to him during their interview about his phone, they asked for his passcode. And initially, he started to give it, and then he's like, it's biometric. That was not true. Later, they talked to him about getting numbers and things like that to call people he needed to talk to, and he gave up his code at the end of this interview. So, during this statement to the detectives, the defendant tried to talk his way out of this crime. He was not honest with the detectives. He thought he was going to outsmart everyone. And his plan was revealed and laid out in this interview. He had familiarized himself with what would be his ultimate defense and argues the charges, saying they're not intentional. How did he familiarize himself with this? You're going to hear in this interview that the defendant says and talks about not doing a second look again. You're going to hear that initially, during the interview, he actually starts, when he realizes the police are accusing him of something, he starts saying, well, on TV, I know the dangers of this. I know the dangers. There was a man who did this just like me, who's now an advocate. Getting out his defense, like, look, I want to be an advocate. I shouldn't be criminally charged in this. He says, I know because when I worked in Tuscaloosa as a dispatcher, there was a canine who passed away in a car after being left out for only 10 minutes. Now, you're also going to hear he told the police he'd been a dispatcher for 5 years. With Tuscaloosa, that wasn't true. It was only about 3. But regardless of that, he talks about, I know the danger because of this. And he also talks about knowing the dangers of this, trying to explain this away, saying, no way I would do this intentionally. I just saw this video on the internet. I saw this video on the internet about a vet who was saying, please, don't leave your pets in the car, and showing how hot it would get inside a car if you were left there. And the defendant, you're going to hear him say in this interview, and I thought to myself, well, that'd be horrible if that happened to my son. You're going to see that video. Because when the police went in, and we'll talk about it in a minute, and did review the computer forensics found from the defendant's computers and his phones, he viewed that video. The name of the video was, How Hot Does It Get in a Parked Car? And you're going to see this video of a veterinarian talking and sitting in a parked car with the windows cracked on a 90-something degree day for only 30 minutes, and describing how awful it is and how a little creature would suffer being left in that car. That's what's in this defendant's head. Because you know what? That veterinarian described the exact thing that the defendant did to his son. And the defendant viewed that video nearly 5 days before he murdered his child in the exact way characterized in that video. Indy argues the charges, starts debating, nobody had ever said at this point, even though the police, you're going to hear, they knew something was up, something was not right. Nobody had ever accused him of doing this intentionally up to that point. And you're going to hear the defendant who keeps bringing it up. I didn't do this intentionally. I didn't do this intentionally. No one had said that to that point. Post-interview statements. Now, after the defendant is interviewed by the police, you're going to hear that they went further and they pulled video of a conversation the defendant had with his wife. And you're going to hear that the defendant had been begging to talk to his wife. And you're going to understand why after you see this. He wants to make sure she knows what his story is and that she is on the same page. In this video, you actually see some emotion from the defendant for the first time. You see some emotion. And what is the main theme of this statement? The things that he's saying to his wife when he gets so upset? He's worried about perception of other people. He's worried she's not going to be on his side. And he says things like, "Why did this happen to me?" He didn't think anybody was going to call him on it. The evidence will show that he thought he was going to get away with this and can't believe that they caught on. Why me? My whole life is over. All I can think about is that jail cell. He actually complains about the little holding cell having an uncomfortable cot and a tin aluminum toilet he has to go to the bathroom in. He tells her several times, "Keep me out of jail so I can be an advocate." And he says at one point, even if I could bring him back, I wouldn't. And in trying to tell his wife, "Oh, he looked really peaceful," and you're going to see the photographs. Unfortunately, you're going to have to look at the photographs of this child lying dead in that pavement. And as those bystanders were gripped with emotion and with sadness and with all kinds of things, again, you'll see how he didn't have those things. He tells her he was peaceful looking and tells his wife, "I was dreading how he would look." Because he knew what had happened that day. Other post-interview statements. This defendant was then, as a standard in most cases, photographed by another detective. They came in and take photographs of him while he was still there in the station wearing the same clothes as before. And after being photographed by the detective, by Detective Racy, Detective Stoddard comes in and tells him what he's been charged with. When they talked to him earlier, he said, "Look, I got to talk to my supervisors, I got to talk to your wife, I got to do this, I got to do that, we got to look at other things," because an investigation like this is fluid, especially in its early hours. And he says, "I think we're probably going to charge you, or you're going to be charged. The charge is going to be cruelty to children." Again, the defendant had debated him about whether it was intentional or not. After looking at it, talking with the supervisors, the detective decided, "You know what, we've got to charge him with murder based upon his actions of leaving that child in the car." And you're going to hear that initially he was charged with felony murder based upon depriving the child of necessary sustenance, which is food and drink and things like that. And it turns out after the autopsy, it was actually hyperthermia, which is not sustenance, but just a different mechanism. So they changed it from one type of cruelty to another at that point. Again, not charging him with anything intentionally at that point, but charging him with the negligent homicide of his child. And when he comes in and informs the defendant that he's being charged with this, the defendant responds, "But there was no malicious intent." Starts arguing the specific elements of malice murder. No malicious intent. And Cobb County Police have never said anything to this point about this being intentional. At the Cobb County Jail, when he goes to get booked, his callousness and his demeanor is reflected there too. you're going to hear that he gets booked into the Cobb County Jail. And while he's there, he comes upon a person who was a student at Georgia Southern. I went to Georgia Southern too, so I guess not one of our prouder moments here, but this person had gotten a DUI over some point over the past year, and since it was the summer, he was having to turn himself in and go serve his hours in jail to complete his jail part of his sentence. And as he's sitting there, in what's kind of called the pit, where everybody comes in with their book and hangs out, this defendant doesn't go sit in a corner, doesn't grieve, doesn't keep to himself. He's not sitting there just despondent about the fact that he just killed his son. He comes in and is like, "Hey, what's up, guys? What's going on?" And sits down and starts chatting it up. "Oh, what are y'all in for?" And expresses being annoyed and things like that. And this student is going to tell you that he had no idea what this guy was in jail for. And then he saw it on the news. Later was like, "Oh my gosh. That's the guy who was arrested for killing his child." Okay. So at this point, he's been arrested. He's at the Cobb County Jail. So the police stop there. At that point, ladies and gentlemen, we've got lies from the police. We've got the defendant checking the crime scene. We've got 0.6 miles he drove with that child right beside him. There is overwhelming evidence that this was not an accident. 0.6 miles, which, by the way, you know where Blinn Academy is here, 0.7 miles? That's further than he had to drive to Chick-fil-A. And a lot further than when he made that decision to go to work and not to daycare. So, the follow-up investigations, they didn't just stop with what you had to that point, with just the crime scene, with the videos, which they actually obtained later, with the defendant's statements. They did more. We talked about video surveillance. They obtained it. When they initially charged him with a negligent homicide, they knew something was up, but they had not seen these videos. And then they started investigating. And they see the video of the defendant pulling in to work. We haven't talked about this yet. We talked about the fact that he sat there in that car for about 30 seconds before he walked into work. But you'll also see, when he parked, he said he had his bag right beside him, so he would have to turn to get his bag going to work. He had a Chick-fil-A cup to his right. He had to make a few turns and navigate that U-turn where traffic's coming from the right, from the left, from on front. But you're going to see when he pulls in to that parking space you saw in there, he pulls around and he stops. This car does not have a backup camera. What does he do? He sees this spot where there's an island right there where nobody can park and a car that's already parked. And there's not an official way to get through there, but there's a narrow way to drive into it. He backs up. He backs up and around in between two vehicles with no backing camera and then pulls into the spot. They saw that in the video after they interviewed him. And then they also see later that he had gone to lunch and gone back to the car. And then they get the video of him leaving. Also, video, just going back to the video, they got Chick-fil-A video. You're going to see that. You're going to see the photographs and the video of the defendant coming in, showing the times that he was there at the Chick-fil-A and when he left. And keep in mind when we're talking about this time frame that's less than 5 minutes, that doesn't count the amount of time it took the defendant to walk out to his car in the Chick-fil-A parking lot, to take his child and strap his child into that car seat that he was 3 inches too tall for. Cooper was 33 inches. This car seat was made for a 30-inch child. You're going to see, and during this time, not only did he walk out there, strap the child in, as he told the police he had this conversation with him, all that time, he still wasn't forgetting, wasn't driving, any of that. So that's not even less than 5 minutes. It's much less than that. We have video of him walking out. of the Chick-fil-A. You have daycare records. And you're going to hear from the daycare workers that, you know what, the defendant took him and brought him almost every morning. That the defendant, when they would go to Chick-fil-A, sometimes he would call and say, hey, do y'all want anything? That he would always call if they were running late, try to get them to say breakfast or something like that, or let them know he's running late. And you'll also hear that sometimes, because he drove, it was a much longer drive if he was driving from home to daycare than Chick-fil-A to daycare. Sometimes if he came in earlier in the day, early in the morning, Cooper would be asleep. Like some kids do, if you're on the road for a while, maybe you fall asleep, things like that. You're going to hear on Chick-fil-A days, the daycare workers would say, he came in wide awake. And the later he would come in, and on this day, when they left Chick-fil-A, it was much later, at 9:20, he would be wide awake. You're going to see the daycare records corroborating that he brought this child over the last 25 days that he'd gone to daycare. The defendant had brought him 19 times. This was normal. This is what he did. You're going to have business records as well, phone records, showing the defendant never called 911. That right after he got out of the car, took Cooper out, fooled around, messing around with CPR for a second, they said, and then walked away. When he got on that phone, you're going to see he had a brief call to his wife and a hang-up. And then he called Little Apron Academy twice. Told the police, oh yeah, I called them because I was afraid my wife would be worried that Cooper wasn't there. Now, they didn't want her to worry that he wasn't there. Your child's dead. These phone calls he's making created defense. And then you're going to see also different types of business records from different messaging services and things like that. Also, you're going to hear from numerous witnesses who were interviewed in this case about the defendant's behavior at the scene. You're going to hear testimony about computers that were seized, and then also phones that were seized. Now, the investigation, when it turned to the videos, they also went and looked at forensic evidence pulled from telephones and from computers to see what he was doing that day. What he was doing that day. What you're going to see is that not only on that day was he messaging women constantly, that he was leading a double life. That he voiced numerous times in random things on an alcohol whisper. I miss being single. I'm at a breaking point just a couple weeks before this. Messaging underage girls as young as 15. This being his obsession. Taking risk after risk after risk. Meeting up with prostitutes while his wife texts him about, you realize, what are you doing? Can you come home? Cooper and I are going to be leaving for several days here soon. You're going to see this double life you get from the phone, from the computers. Now, what types of evidence will we prove to prove guilt in this case? You're going to have direct evidence, circumstantial evidence, expert testimony, and motive evidence. Let's start with direct evidence. First, the direct evidence, there's no doubt the defendant is responsible for Cooper's death. The defendant's admissions that he is the one who took Cooper, that he is the one who locked him in that car and left him, that he is the one who drove him that day, the Home Depot parking lot showing it, and the child's body. That is direct evidence that he caused this child's death. And proving malice, the direct evidence. Messaging on the morning of the murder that he needed an escape from his son, 5 minutes from getting just that. Malice. There's nothing more malicious than what was done to this child's body, baking in that car for 7 hours. The number of hours in that car, every second, every minute, every hour that he chose to leave that child out there is malice. The Home Depot video of the defendant, how he parked, going back to the car at lunch, that is malice. And the defendant's own words, knowing what this would do to somebody. Oh, I would hate for that to happen to my son. Malice. Circumstantial evidence. And the judge will tell you later at the end of this case, direct evidence, circumstantial evidence, one isn't better than the other, they're just different types of evidence. What type of circumstantial evidence are you going to see in this case? Well, his behavior at the scene. You're going to hear about his lies to the police, omitting the things that convict him. You're going to hear about the script to convince the police. He had thought this out. The distance between Chick-fil-A and Treehouse, circumstantial evidence, and the time it took to get there when you piece the times from these videos together. Okay, expert evidence. In this case, well, first of all, you have the medical exam. You're going to hear about the autopsy. Cause of death, hyperthermia. Caused by being left out in that car for that long. Manner of the death in this case, you're going to hear, at the time, the medical examiner, he actually was leaving right at the time he had to get his report out. When he did, he marked it as undetermined. He'd already told the police he thought it was going to be homicide, but he knew the police still were in there investigative, still doing investigations, and so he ruled it undetermined. And you're going to hear him testify that based upon the conclusion of the evidence or the investigation in this case, it is a homicide. You're also going to hear about the damage that was done to this child from the medical examiner, about how he suffered this death. And there'll be no doubt that based upon the nature and the length of the suffering, this child suffered horrible physical pain, which is regarding counts 4 and 5, cruelty counts. Cruel and excessive physical pain. There can be no more cruel and excessive physical pain than what this child suffered. Other expert testimony you're going to hear. There was temperature testing done on this car. The car was taken back to the Home Depot parking lot a couple weeks later, and was experts in the field of trying to determine how hot it gets inside of a car and things of that nature came out and did testing on it to show, and you'll get to hear, how hot this car or a car can get on a hot summer day. On this day that the defendant left Cooper in the car, it got up to 92 degrees. And just coincidence, happened to be the hottest day of the year that he chose to leave his son in the car up to that point. And you'll see there was a web search on his phone that he had Googled, why does it get hazy on a hot day, the day before the murder? And that he had gone to weatherpredictor.com the day before the murder. And so you're going to get this expert testimony about how this actually works, how cars heat up and things of that nature. And then you're also going to have expert testimony about the computer forensics, about how the detectives go in and extract this evidence, how they do it. And then crime scene analysis as well. You're going to see crime scene analysis and 3D scans and things of that nature, showing you the crime scene in the different perspectives and photographs of the different places where things happen in the different perspectives. So, in addition to that, you're going to have motive evidence. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I know we watch a lot of TV sometimes, and we think we hear things that are legalistic, and beyond a shadow of a doubt, motive, premeditation, things like that. As the judge said, y'all got to throw that out. What the judge tells you the law is what you have to follow. And the judge is going to tell you that motive is not an element in a homicide case or in a crime. And that's for several reasons. I mean, obviously, atrocities are committed every day all across this globe for no good reason. Sometimes people who kill go to their graves with that motive still buried deep inside them, and we don't know why they did what they did. But in this case, ladies and gentlemen, we have a motive. The defendant told us his motive 10 minutes before he follow through on it. Motive evidence. Talking about wanting that double life, or leading that double life. You're going to see several messages where he specifically says, I lead a double life. And you're going to hear from several of the girls he was messaging on the day of the incident and before. One, initials JM, for example. He met her online in 2013, right after she turned 18 years of age. The defendant lied about his age, said he was 25. You find out later, oh no, he was in his 30s. Talked to her, struck up a relationship. And in that vein, struck up a relationship with her. Started sending messages back and forth where they called themselves best friends. But it wasn't just best friends. You're going to hear the defendant was in love with this young girl who lived hours away from him. You're going to hear about how he showed up at a Walmart in her hometown hours away to see her. And how they sat in his car and kissed. You're going to hear how that relationship continued. And how he even deceived her. Told her she was the only one. And you're going to hear about all kinds of girls he was talking to and things like that in this double life. His motive, his obsession for wanting to remove the biggest obstacle to him leading that life. You're going to hear that he told her he loved her, and that around March of 2014, she had started dating somebody, and they kind of broke it off. They still talked, but the guy she's dating found out they'd messaged, and you're going to hear he was very upset about this. And you'll see messages over the course of the next 3 months leading up to the morning of, where the defendant would become despondent that she wouldn't respond to him. And that the days before the murder, just one of these motives, just so you know what's going on in his head, he had messaged her and she had cut him off. Basically, she was using, or they were using, a messenger application called Kik. Now, what you're going to hear about Kik is, it's mostly used by teenagers to message each other. I think we heard that during jury selection. Well, this grown man was using Kik. And that when you decide to get off a Kik or cut off somebody that's messaging you, you get a response that says, this person has left the conversation. This person has left the conversation. Well, in the days leading up to this, it had happened several times over those months, and it happened in the days leading up to Cooper's death. And that on the day before, he said, you're gone again, and that makes me sad. And on the morning of June 18, 2014, he made one last failed attempt and tried to message her with no response. That's just one example. And you're going to hear that, he would talk about his child. Once he got in there and was talking to these girls and was comfortable, found out they like kids and things like that. Some girls he wouldn't tell he had children or a wife, or a child and a wife. Others he would. When he found out that, he would talk about Cooper and things like that. And she'll tell you, yes, yeah, he talked about Cooper, said he loved him. Of course, nobody's going to talk to a girl they're trying to hook up with and say, I really hate my child or anything like that. But you'll hear about that. But you're also going to see that in the months leading up to this, those photographs and those comments lessen. You're going to hear from daycare that 2 weeks before this homicide, before this murder, the defendant had been sending a picture, texting a picture, taking a picture of his son every day and sending it to his wife to say, hey, we got here, he's here, got him to daycare. 2 weeks before this, he stopped. You're going to hear that he told the daycare workers, he's just getting too old for that. And you're going to hear his talk about Cooper leading up to this lessons and lessons as well, as far as talking to these other girls. He wanted to be free to go out. You're going to hear messages that he sent in this regard to sleep with as many people as possible. His behavior, the evidence will show, was escalating and spiraling out of control leading up to this. Not just these underage girls or teenage girls that he was trying to start relationships with, but he was going to prostitutes. You're going to hear that on May 31st, 2014. He had numerous web searches for prostitutes and things of that nature. But on that day, he met up with one you're going to hear from her at a hotel in Marietta, Georgia, and had sex with her, while his wife and child were at home. You're going to hear that it spiraled out that 2 days before that, he was messaging what turned out to be a 15-year-old girl. And when he found out she was 15 and she'd sent a picture of his vagina, he said, well, make me a dirty old man. His behavior was spiraling out of control. And he says, right around that same point, that he was near a breaking point. He admitted he had a double life. And the motive evidence is shown through the messages at Chick-fil-A and while he's driving to work. All of these types of evidence will prove guilt in this case. This is a case of contrast. An innocent child versus a father who abandoned his responsibilities. This case is about a defendant that he wanted friends and family to see. He's very worried about perception. You're going to see that. Very worried about perception versus the real Justin Ross Harris. And it's about the life he was forced to lead versus the life he wanted to lead. You see, everybody, when the police talk to friends, family, things like that, family seems to be good. Seems to love his wife, seems to be a good father. Then you're going to hear from people who saw the other side. People who asked him how you could do this. After he brought up, I'm a lead guitarist in the church. Trying to use his role in the church as a guitarist in his messaging with these girls. A girl who asked him, does your conscience ever kick in 2 weeks before this murder? You know what his answer was? Nope. Where's the real conflict in this case? It's not who locked Cooper in that car. It's not how did Cooper die. And it's not who killed Cooper. The only issue in this case is there malice. Is he guilty of counts 3, 5, and 6 through 8? Or is there malice and he's guilty of all counts? And after you hear the evidence in this case, there will be no question he is guilty of everything he is charged with. This case will really be about the defendant versus the evidence. Now, we talked a little bit about the facts in the case. As the judge told you, this isn't going to be over in a day or two. We have to go through a number of witnesses, a lengthy investigation to make sure that they've done everything they needed to, the Cobb County Police did. Where it would have been so easy just to say, you know what, we're going to chalk this up as negligent homicide and not look any further. So it's going to take a little while. But in that, not only about the things we talked about, the video showing he's guilty, the messaging showing he's guilty, there are other things they're going to show he's guilty. And it's the defendant versus the evidence. Okay. Triggers. As the defendant said, as you are going to hear, he tried to say that, I must have forgotten him on the way to work. You're going to hear about several things, several triggers, that if he had really forgotten that child and was really just negligent about this, he would have remembered. First, he took Cooper to daycare almost every morning. You can see the Home Depot building where that daycare is from the intersection that he drove through. You're going to hear about an email to the defendant about a vacation 10 minutes after he parked that car. Now, you're going to hear about this because in the defendant's statement to the police, he tried to say, well, I totally would not have done this intentionally. We were planning a vacation. We were planning a vacation, a family vacation. Cooper was going to go. You're going to hear that while he portrayed it that way, and it was portrayed that he was really pushing this, you're going to hear how it really went down. The computer evidence is going to show that while he did, on June 9th or so, there were texts, emails back and forth about, hey, let's go on a cruise, things like that. he was supposed to follow up with a travel agent. And you're going to hear that he got a text. You're going to see the text to the defendant from his sister-in-law saying, hey, have you followed up with that travel agent yet? And he doesn't respond for a while. But then finally he says, oh, yeah, I'm waiting to hear back. But you're going to see the email records. He hadn't done that yet. It was only after getting texted by his sister-in-law that he actually did that. And then he sent an email to a travel agent on the day before the murder. And then you're going to hear that that next morning, 10 minutes after he would have walked in the building, he got an email back from her with options. An email he never responded to because he knew there was no way he was going on that vacation with Cooper. And you're also going to hear that not only when he was Googling about Carnival Cruise Lines and things like that the day before the murder, he was also Googling about Sandals vacations, Antigua, things like that. Vacations that don't involve a child. And you're going to hear that he made posts about not having had a real vacation in a long time. Posts he made right around the same time, right after he got back from a vacation to the beach around Memorial Day weekend, 2014, a few weeks before this murder. He and his wife and Cooper, a vacation that he argued with her about because he did not want to take Cooper on that vacation. So when we start talking about vacation, keep all that in mind. Also, 10:46 a.m., you're going to see a message to another one of these random women on the app Whisper. She posts something about getting up early, and he responds, talking about Cooper. About an hour after this. Oh yeah, my son woke me up at 5:30 this morning. And then she asked, well, how old is he too? Yeah, he's awesome. So an hour after this, he has messaged about his son getting up. And then at 10:49 a.m., his wife actually texts him. An hour and 20 minutes after getting out of the car, you get to work okay? And he says, yep. And you will see on the phone, right above that, where she asked this, there's Cooper's name. I've got Cooper from a message the day before after he picked the child up. I've got Cooper. If he had really forgotten his child, that would have been a trigger. But it wasn't, because we all know, and the evidence will show, that this was intentional. Also, he got an email from Little Apron Academy that day. Where in the world, you guys may know, the daycare send emails sometimes about, what's going on today, things like that. He got an email that day as well. And then his text to Leanna at 3:16 p.m. When are you going to get my boy? When are you going to get my buddy? Trying to figure out what time she was going to leave. Because it wasn't like you're going to hear that she worked anywhere close to where that daycare was. Unlike him, you're going to hear that she worked about 50 minutes away. And he knew he had lag time, and it was going to take her a while to get him, and he was trying to figure out when it was he needed to leave. Let's talk about some things that were not in his routine that you're going to see. It wasn't his routine to skip lunch in order to work, and you're going to see chats between this defendant and his buddies. They chatted on G-Chat all the time. His buddies, Winston and Alex, who also worked at Home Depot, but worked in the main headquarters across the street. They went to lunch like every day, would always go out to eat, and in their chats talk about, what are we going to eat today? What are we going to do this? When are we going to do that? You're going to see from these chats, this defendant never talked about skipping lunch to get work done. You're going to hear about his schedule. He could kind of come and go as he pleased. He would come in 9, 9:30, leave 4, 4:30, 6, whatever. It was very flexible. But this day, he said, you know what, guys? I think I may skip lunch. I may beg out today. I want to be able to leave early to go to this movie. What else is not routine? To tell friends that he would only go if someone else was driving. on this case, on this day, while they're asking him about lunch, he says, okay, well, y'all convince me where we're going to go. And then he says, well, I'll go if y'all come pick me up. He hadn't done that before. And you know why he did it? Because he knew he couldn't drive, because he knew what was in that car. It was not his routine to have his friends drop him off at his car. His friends would say, no, that was out of the ordinary. He didn't usually do that. They stopped him bought light bulbs, of all things. And he had missing light bulbs that were out in his house. But they never stopped for him to drop something off in the car. And he had no problem bringing things into the office with him. As you're going to see, a week before this, the defendant was seen on video and witnesses saw him come into the office. And that day, he didn't have a problem bringing something into the office, something that doesn't talk, something that's not alive. He brought his guitar in. He remembered to bring his guitar in a week before. And when people asked him about it, he said, I don't want to leave my guitar out in the car so it gets hot. There's no problem bringing things into the office. And as we already talked about, asking his wife what time she's getting Cooper, after it was already decided that she was definitely the one picking up. There had been no reason for him to ask that. Okay, emails. Knowledge and state of mind. How was this formed in his head? How did he come up with this? You're going to hear about emails that go to his knowledge and state of mind. Emails about children being left in cars. Don't leave your children in the car. Things of that nature. He received 2013. His wife sent him a link about this happening to somebody up in New York. 2014, in May, about the Look Again campaign. In April 2014, the Look Again campaign. At the scene, minutes after pulling his dead child out of a car, he's already spouting out, I didn't do a second look. And then, an hour or so after this, telling the police that he just wants to be an advocate, like the guy I saw on TV that this happened to, just like me. And then the video we talked about, how hot was he getting in a parked car 5 days before the murder. We talked about the double life. We talked about the fact that he let everybody think, and everybody thought that his marriage was good, there were no problems. He was very proud in his conversations about his work with the church. And you're going to hear that this double life, he portrayed himself as, even to the people that he was communicating with, very involved in his church, and actually used that, hey, I'm a lead guitarist to some of these younger girls. And you're going to hear that he led a double life. Those two things don't jive. You're going to hear that the defendant had a double life that was spiraling out of control. And then, in addition to all that, it comes back to the common sense, basic facts in this case. 0.6 miles, just a few minutes away. 30 seconds with Cooper after the car was parked. Back to the car at lunch, and then the departure. And that stench. During this trial, remain focused. Remain focused on what's important. Focus on the defendant and what he did. This case is about Cooper. This case is about what was done to him. And this case is about who is guilty for doing it. And the evidence in this case, it will be clear about all three things. The defendant's own words. The defendant versus the evidence. The defendant's own words show that he's guilty. The defendant's incriminating and conflicting statements, his texts and emails, what he really intended, what he said before getting caught, and his attempts to manipulate the situation and commit a fraud upon everybody in this investigation. Remember all of these things during trial. keep in mind what he told one of these witnesses, one of these girls, back on June the 4th, 2014, when she asked him, after he said, yeah, I'm the lead guitarist in my church. So you still consider, even though you're married, having sex with other women? He says, yep. And then she asked him, does your conscience ever kick in? And he says, no. It didn't kick in then, and it didn't kick in on June the 18th, 2014. In this case, it's the state's burden to prove the defendant guilty. It belongs to the state, and it's the state's burden to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. And the key word there is reasonable. Any reasonable view of the facts that you're going to see shows this defendant intentionally murdered this child. There would be no doubt the defendant, and the proof will be that he locked the child in the car. That because he locked this child in the car, Cooper is dead, and that the defendant is clearly guilty of all counts, including malice murder. I love my son-in-law, but we both need escapes. I love my son-in-law, but we both need escapes. Death, deception, and a double life. On June 18, 2014, the defendant killed Cooper. The defendant killed, committed murder, and the evidence will prove this beyond a reasonable doubt. At the end of this case, ladies and gentlemen, we're just going to ask you to do a couple of simple things. Use your good common sense. Use your good common sense with all the evidence in this case. And hold this man responsible for trying to escape from one life and into another, and killing a child in one of the most unimaginable, horrible ways. Thank you.
We'll take a mid-afternoon recess. Before you go, listen. Open mind. Don't discuss the matter. Notepads. You can take them with you. You'll have a good break. We'll break until 20 till.